So now a formal welcome from me from Budapest, and Zsófi's sitting right behind me on the other side of the wall. So it's really nice to see her too, because I haven't had the chance to see her today, but it's great to see you all in this Zoom space. And I'm very happy also to welcome Thomas Coombes. Some of you might actually have met him and might know him quite well, and others will get the chance to get to know you, Thomas, next week when we meet in Berlin. And the reason why we're doing this Zoom now is because this we thought would be a great way both to warm up before we meet in Berlin for the camp on how to be better human rights communicators and how to actually come up with something new and more persuasive in human rights communication. But also because there are some of the things that we thought we could bring ahead. Beyond the warm-up, there are some theoretical underpinnings that Thomas will run us through, and this will also give us an opportunity to have a short Q&A. And I see everybody's super diligent, and you put your names and your organizations already in the chat window. But perhaps it would be good to just do a little round so that Thomas knows who we are. This is not everybody from the RARE2 group, but most of them. Thomas already knows about RARE because he was our great trainer for the first group of RARE, and we had a human rights communication camp in June 2021, which seems already like a long time ago. So could we just start, everybody, just, you know, your name, what you do, and something else, not very long, just very quickly. And Zuzana, start, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, Thomas. My name is Zuzana, and I work for Organization for Aid to Refugees, OPU, which is an NGO based in the Czech Republic, established in 1991, and we do social, legal, and psychological counseling to asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants in Czech Republic. And I go by she, her, and I'm gonna finish with that.
And go ahead saying somebody else's name that and pass the.
Sure. Yes. Sure. So how are you? Ines?
Hi. Good afternoon. Thanks, Susanna. My name is Inês. I work for the Portuguese Refugee Council, a Portuguese NGO that works towards a fairer asylum system in Portugal. We do a lot of direct assistance, but also training and monitoring of the national asylum system. And personally, I work at the legal department. So I think that's it. So Margarita.
Thank you, Inês. So I'm Margarita from Ekaterina Karavelova Foundation, based in Bulgaria. We work mainly on women's rights and gender equality, putting a lot of focus on empowering women to participate in decision-making processes. So we monitor our never-ending elections, with a few more coming this year. And I'll pass the virtual ball to my colleague from Bulgaria, Zahari.
Thank you, Maggie. My name is Zahari, and I work in the Bulgarian Center for Not-for-Profit Law. We are a human rights organization. We're mainly focused on freedom of association, of course, freedom of assembly, but we also do some other side projects like connected to social entrepreneurship, the rights of children, victims or perpetrators of crimes, and certain aspects of the rights of people with disabilities. And I'll pass to Victoria.
Hi everyone. My apologies that I cannot adjust my name of the organization and the pronouns because I'm having the call on my phone since my audio on the PC is not working, but that's not important. Sorry. So my name is Victoria. I work as a lawyer in Via Juris, which is Slovak non-governmental organization focusing mostly on rule of law, but also environmental issues and participation in public policies. So nice to see you after a while. And I'm passing the ball to Dalma.
Thank you, Victoria. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. Hello, my name is Dalma. I work with the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union based in Budapest, Hungary. It is a watchdog human rights organization that covers topics, a wide range of topics, from political freedoms and liberties to privacy rights and non-discrimination and equality. I'm a lawyer by profession, and I've participated in strategic litigation, advocacy, but also in public education campaigns and campaigns in general. So I'm interested in this topic. Thank you. And I'm calling to talk. Ula, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ursula Getzuk. I work as an international advocacy coordinator and a lawyer in FEDEA, which is a Foundation for Women and Family Planning, based in Warsaw, Poland. At this very moment, we deal with abortion, rights of access to abortion in Poland, mostly. And we do advocacy, strategic litigation, service provision, whatever helps. Thank you. And I will pass the floor to Domen.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Domen. I'm coming from Slovenia. I'm running a Citizen D NGO, and we are focusing on human rights in, let's say, the digital sphere. So everything related to surveillance, freedom of expression, and yeah, in the digital landscape. And I'm going to go with Calum.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice to meet you, Thomas. My name's Calum. I'm based in Prague in the Czech Republic, but I'm working for an international nonprofit called the Internet Society, where we're doing advocacy for an open internet, global internet, secure and trustworthy internet. The portfolios I'm working on, it's member state level, but also at EU level. So yeah, that's me. And I'll pass to Aaron, maybe.
Thank you, Callum. Hi, hey, Thomas, good to see you. So I'm Aaron, I'm the head of research and communication in Amnesty Hungary. We do research on the rule of law, gender equality and LGBTI rights. And I'll pass it to Jofi.
Hi, I'm the one sitting in the room behind Marty, next to us from the HHC. My name is Jofi, and I'm the head of the Justice Department. And I'm passing to Andres.
Hi, I'm Andres, co-director of Iridia Center for Human Rights. We are based in Barcelona and Madrid, and we work in strategic litigation and advocacy, and I work in the strategic of advocacy and communication. And I pass the ball to Aisha.
Yes, thank you, Andres. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Aisha. I work at the Netherlands Helsinki Committee. We work on supporting catalyst of change across Europe, and I work within the Human Rights Defense Program as an advocacy officer. And I pass the floor on to Dite.
Hey everyone, Dite. I'm from Copenhagen, Denmark. I am the director of the NGO called Center for the Analysis of Power Relations. On a daily basis, I work to prevent violence in all different types, especially systemical types of violences. And we also have a femicide watch, so monitoring the murders of women. Nice to meet you, Thomas. Looking forward to Berlin. I'm sorry, I'm going to pass it on to Sophia.
Thank you. Hi, Thomas and everyone. This is Zsófia, another one, or you can call me Sophia. I'm also from Hungary, Budapest, and I'm co-founder of Unhacked Democracy. We are a relatively new organization, and we have been working to protect electoral integrity in Hungary. that includes advocacy work and capacity building for poll workers. And right now, we are trying to put the organization on a new path to unhack democracy, really unhack it. And I'll pass it on to Simona in Bucharest.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Sofia. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all in 2023. I think it's the first time we are seeing each other. Have an excellent year, all of you, and you, Thomas, as well. I'm working with Civil Society Development Foundation, yes, in Bucharest. But the organization I work with is a support organization for other NGOs. And we are trying to cover, let's say, all the relevant aspects for the functioning of the NGO sector and make it relevant and counting in front of authorities either at national, regional, or European level. I have a legal background myself. I used to be a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer anymore. I'm the head of development and sometimes advocacy in CSDF. Thank you. And I'm passing the mic to Frédéric. She's no longer with us. Who else?
Maciej, maybe, until Frederic joins us.
Yeah, exactly.
Hello, nice to see you all. My name is Maciej Nowicki, and I work for the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. Federica is back, and we are dealing with civil and political rights and the rule of law in Poland on pan-European level, and also in countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asian Caucasus region. So I'm looking very much forward for today and to Berlin. And I'm passing it now to Federica.
Sorry, thank you. Good afternoon. I had a quick internet breakdown, sorry. So my name is Frédéric. I'm the director of the Human Rights City Network. We are based in Brussels, but I'm also half located in Tirana, in Albania. The purpose of our organization is really to entrench a human rights-based approach in public policies of cities, and we try to have a participatory approach with civil society related to that they work both hand in hand together. And yeah, we have our scope is Europe to the geographical scope of the Council of Europe, I would say. And nice meeting you, Thomas, and looking forward to hear more. And I pass the floor to who hasn't been talking yet, to Zefa? No.
Maybe give a wave if you haven't gone yet.
Sorry?
Maybe if anyone who hasn't gone can wave, and then we can.
Because for my screen, Georgia.
Okay, sorry, I'm having some issues. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Yeah, hi, I am Georgia. Some of you might have already met me in Talent. I would say most of you. I'm the executive assistant. So I work for Hertie School, and I have been assisting with the organization program, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing you all in Berlin next week. Is there anyone else that has not? Okay, perfect.
So while I enable screen share for Thomas, I want to thank you for coming. And this is a great round, and you can see, Thomas, how extremely varied this group is geographically and also in terms of the work that everybody's doing. This will be the third time that we meet in Berlin. So by now, I think we already know a little bit about our organizations, but this will allow us to explore some of the challenges and successes and achievements. So I will hand over now the floor to Thomas if I've managed to.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Really lovely to see you all. I'm really looking forward to welcoming you in my adopted home city of Berlin and talking to you more. So yeah, as Marta said, what we just thought would be nice to do is that I will present the approach I use to work on human rights communications and narrative change, which is called hope-based communications. So I'm going to present sort of the main ideas to you now, and I'll do a bit of presenting still next week, but then if we get most of the theory done today, first of all, some of these ideas can sink in a little bit for you, but also we'll have more time to actually work on stuff together. And with all of you together in the same room, I think it's so much nicer if we're actually already co-creating stuff rather than just me lecturing. So thanks so much for taking a bit of extra time so that we can talk about this a little bit. So you should all be able to see my slides now. So hope-based communications is something I developed while working at Amnesty International. It's primarily developed to help human rights activists, and by that I mean all of us, people who are trying to make people care about human rights, essentially, work on narrative and also just draw on insights from the worlds of neuroscience and psychology and basically persuasion, right? What is making human beings tick? How do we change their minds? And so basically, because I feel all these things are things all of us can do. And so, but I think we all know the challenges human rights face, particularly in Europe. So this is why I've developed this. So for me, particularly, the important thing is I believe this is really accessible for all of us. So the key goal really is for us to identify what is it we want the narrative to be around human rights. And I think just a crucial thing I'll say now, and I'll repeat throughout, is, so when I talk about hope, being hope-based, primarily at first it's about the emotions we need in our audience for them to support human rights outcomes. But it also means we're basing our communications and our activism on the things we hope for. So it's very much goal-oriented. It's about the things we want to achieve in future. And so there's a very key important distinction here that when we say hope, we're talking about a belief that the future can be better and then taking action towards that future, which is distinct from being positive about the present, right? And thinking things are okay or things will turn out okay. And that's very different, right? So when we're talking about hope, we're not saying, oh, everything's fine. We're saying we have faced challenges, but hope is about that resilience and that forward thinking of like, how can we make things better by acting? And so the basic idea of hope-based communications is built around these 5 shifts. And so another thing I'll say right from the start is, right now, a lot of the story we tell in human rights is based on these things on the left. And what we're trying to do is fill the gaps in our story a little bit. So it's not about ignoring the things on the left, but balancing them out with the things on the right. So not just telling people that there's a problem, but also making sure that we are actually doing a good job of explaining what our solution is, for example. So I'm going to take you through it. So the idea is that these are questions and shifts any person doing any work within human rights can ask themselves, and indeed in other movements. So that's the point of this approach is not that someone like me will come along and tell you what your narrative should be, but that all of us can actually figure it out ourselves using these prompts. And really, so what we're going to be looking at doing is thinking about, well, what is it we're trying to actually communicate? How do we actually want to communicate that to people? So what is the change we're offering? How do we actually bring that change about? What is the sort of why, as in the case we're going to make for our change? How do we actually convince people our change is actually worth happening? And also the story of who are these change makers in our story. So let's just jump right in and start with the first shift, which is about fear to hope. So this is really driven by thinking about what is the emotion or like the feeling we need audiences to have in order for them to support our change goal. And this is really the starting point, which it's when I first started thinking about this, I was trying to think, what is the emotion I want people to feel when they hear the human rights communications coming from Amnesty International, particularly thinking about people on the move seeking asylum or just moving for economic opportunity, whatever reason. And for me, that emotion was compassion, right? Or empathy or compassion. We can go into at some point if people are interested, the nuances there. But essentially that I want people to care about other people because they're human beings. And that's something that I think everyone can agree we're seeing a bit challenged in Europe and elsewhere. So we're trying to look at what are the things we need to do to actually make sure we have those things. So we're going to look throughout this presentation at the brain science that might help us add new tools to our human rights work to help us actually change people's attitudes and change their behavior over the long term. So the first concept that I want to introduce to you is a way of thinking about the brain, which is very, very simplified, right? So there's so much findings from neuroscience that I think are really relevant to human rights. And among those findings are just how incredibly complex the way our brain functions is. So this is a metaphor that some neuroscientists have used actually for child psychology. So what I want to present first, give you that caveat that like there's a whole lot more detail we can get into, but it's a very useful metaphor to think about the brain to get us started. So there's this idea of an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. So the downstairs brain is something you might have heard of before, which is our fear response. So, you know, through evolution, when we were living in caves, when we see danger, our bodies, you know, go into defense mode to react to that danger. It's sometimes called a fight or flight response, or even fight, flight, or freeze response. What's really important for us here is that that response really shuts down what some people might call more evolved aspects of the brain. So, you know, if we face danger and we need to run away, our brain doesn't want us to stop and think about the metaphysics of that danger. It just wants us to start moving our legs really fast. So reflective thought comes later, right? So that's, you know, it can, this is, and so the key point is our brains actually haven't evolved much more since we were living in caves. They haven't evolved yet new functions to deal with the internet. So if we see someone writing a snarky tweet at us, or we get an email from a colleague who's been mean to us in the past, our downstairs brain, our fight or flight response is kicking in just as if we saw a tiger coming towards us. And it increases our heart rate. We might start, our sweat glands might open. We might start sweating more. We start pumping blood away from our brain, for example, towards our legs, all these sort of, our body's basically kicking into, you know, what do we need to keep us alive, basically. I don't know if you've ever had like moments like this when you've then kind of reacted angrily yourself to someone and then later it's, oh, why did I do that? Actually, I wish I'd just been a bit more friendly instead. That was because, again, our downstairs brain had taken over. Now, what's important for us in terms of that compassion and empathy that we want to trigger in our audiences, brain scanning tells us that when we're feeling those feelings of thinking about another person's perspective, that's a very different part of the brain that's firing up from this downstairs brain I've been talking about. So that's what it's called the prefrontal cortex, but it's basically where you see on this graph the upstairs brain. It's this is the part of the brain that's active when we're not in that fight or flight mode. When we're feeling more safe and calm, if we do some breathing and some mindfulness meditation, we can start to be more reflective. You might have heard of the book Thinking Fast and Slow. So that's very much the thinking fast is in our downstairs brain and the thinking slow is that upstairs brain. So just I won't go much deeper. We'll come back to this, to the brain stuff in a moment, but let's for now, this key point is this idea of thinking about other people, thinking long-term, say, you know, about raising taxes to tackle climate change, for example, all those kind of deeper reflective modes of being and contemplating are things that are more likely to be triggered when we're in this sort of calmer space, whereas fear and anger and stress and also constant anxiety that's such you know, prevalent in our societies really are not conducive to that and to that compassion we want people to feel. One thing that's really interesting on this, for example, is humor is being really strongly tied by researchers to empathy as well and compassion. So, you know, laughter, joking, for one thing, it disarms people and makes them less defensive, and then they're more open to hearing the experiences of others. So there's an interesting challenge here for us, right? Because our job is to bring to light the most horrible things happening in the world right now. So how can we use humor and joy and make people feel safe and confident when we have these terrible stories to deliver? So let's, for example, right, when we talk about populists, we always want to talk about the threat they pose, how dangerous it would be if they came to power, give people that sense of urgency. So let's look back at a story from 1988, when the dictator Augusto Pinochet was pressured by the international community to hold a referendum on whether or not he would stay in power. And there's a wonderful movie about it. You can watch it with Gal Garcia Bernal. It's just called No. So the opposition to Pinochet was given 15 minutes of airtime to make the case against Pinochet, or so basically to have people vote no to Pinochet. While obviously, Pinochet owned most of the media and he had the Yes campaign. So already they were a bit on the defensive because, they're just saying no to Pinochet, but then what are they for? So this movie really beautifully shows how the opposition to Pinochet used this 15 minutes of airtime to build a campaign that really mobilized voters to actually get rid of him. And what you'll see in the movie is they originally planned to make an advertisement that's about the horror of life under Pinochet, the executions, the torture, the disappearances. But the problem was, first of all, that was reminding people of how dangerous Pinochet was, and that if you go and vote against him, you're risking your own life because he's such a repressive regime, and police were breaking into their meetings and opposition meetings and beating up protesters all the time. So that was just making people think that Pinochet was inevitable. Is the only, you can't stop him. He's so powerful. And so the character that Gal Bernal plays in this movie is an advertising agent who comes along and says, well, this doesn't sell. And so he tries to make a different kind of advertisement, which is basically an ad showing people the alternative to Pinochet, basically showing what freedom looks like. And so before I give you more context, let's just have a look at it and see what you think. So the advertisement is called Chile, Happiness is Coming.
Yo soy libre de pensar, porque siento que es la hora de ganar la libertad. Hasta cuando ya de abusos es el tiempo de cambiar, porque basta de miseria, voy a decir que no.
Porque nace el arco iris después de la tempestad, porque quiero que florezcan mis maneras de pensar, porque sin la dictadura la alegría va a llegar, porque pienso en el futuro, voy a decir que no. Vamos a decir que no, oh.
Con la fuerza de mi voz.
Vamos a decir que no, oh. Yo lo canto sin temor. Vamos a decir que no, oh.
Todos juntos a triunfar.
Vamos a decir que no, por la vida y por la paz.
Terminemos con la muerte, es la oportunidad.
Debe ser a la violencia con las armas de la paz.
Porque creo que mi patria necesita dignidad.
Por el Chile para todos, vamos a decir que no. Vamos a decir que no, oh.
Con la fuerza de mi voz.
Vamos a decir que no, oh. Yo lo canto sin temor. Vamos a decir que no, oh.
Todos juntos a triunfar.
Vamos a decir que no, por la vida y por la paz. Vamos a decir que no, Chile, la alegría viene. Chile, la alegría viene. Chile, la alegría viene.
So I'm just going to stop the share for a second because I would like to check, first of all, if anyone has any thoughts or reactions to that, but also did any of you or how many of you have issues playing, like did the video play well for you? Was it, stop starty? Great. Just because, okay, sometimes people have bad reception, and then if that's the case for anyone, I'll save some videos for when we're in person. Any reactions to that video? It looks a bit like a yogurt commercial, I know. How did it make you feel? You can use the chat or give me a wave if you want to. Oh, Sophia. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, got it. Thanks. Yeah. Well, it made me smile. Obviously, it made me happy. I mean, you cannot not, but it also made me skeptical. And I immediately thought, well, the Hungarian government is doing something similar because they've been brainwashing people how wonderful this country is. So it made me happy, but also made me feel doubtful.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? It's a really great point.
Sorry, can I just add? It made me think a little bit about the Coca-Cola commercial with, like, they were talking about revolution and buy Coca-Cola for revolution. And I thought
Pepsi, yeah, the Pepsi one with
yeah, Pepsi, a bit phony.
Yes. Callum?
Yeah, I was gonna say I was thinking about it, and it's really accessible to people because I think it's the kind of style of the time, almost looks like a film, or yeah, people have said advertisements, stuff like that. So I think people who are not political at all might watch it and just kind of enjoy it and actually absorb the message, whereas sometimes people might just exit immediately with other kinds of approaches. So I liked it.
Thanks. And that's actually a very good point. I should have said, for context, this was the 80s, right? So even an advertising company today, Coca-Cola wouldn't run this ad today, obviously, so they would do a different kind of thing. But so, yes, let's look at what this ad was doing effectively. So this great point by Chofi about the fact that it made you smile. So really key insight is, can I just check, by the way, you should see my screen now, so please shout if you can't. You should see the slides again. We mirror the emotions we see. So that's why you might be watching a silly movie and then a character starts crying and you start crying and you think, like, I don't like this movie. Why is it making me cry? So we have very strong, they're called mirror neurons in our brain. So we really are wired for empathy as human beings. We're going to come back to that point later. But so when we see emotions, we can't help but also feel those emotions, unless obviously there's a whole thing of like in-group and out-group. That's also something we can come back to. But so basically the goal here, there was a strategic need to make people feel hopeful in order for them to go out and vote to get rid of Pinochet. What that was also doing, and Callum said that people could see themselves. So it was showing them a future, and then they could see themselves in that future. So there was all different aspects of Chile. Pinochet's campaign was trying to be very divisive, right? Like rich versus poor, intellectuals versus workers, communists who would, their advertising was very, very fear-based. If Pinochet goes, the communists will take over and turn us into the Soviet Union, this kind of thing. So, like co-workers could see themselves. And then the top left, we see, the sense of we're doing this together. There's a real unifying message here. We're all of us going and changing this together. And also there's a real spirit of, really it's an ad for empathy. There's people, you saw these people shaking hands. Two people, they seem to be at a phone booth and to suddenly meet each other for the first time and hug. So there's this sense of reconciliation. So one thing we'll look at a lot with, when we look at values is, if we identify underlying ways of thinking, ideas, feelings that are really important to our cause, we can actually try and do communication that gets these ideas or feelings across without always being immediately talking about our issue, because sometimes people aren't ready necessarily to hear about our issue, but they might be ready to hear about our values. And we'll see a little bit later on that actually how people are thinking is quite a lot more important than what they're thinking. So let's come back to that. Take a note on that. And then there's just one point on like what happens when an Orban or a Modi or Bolsonaro also uses hope. So a key point is that hope, like a lot like psychology and neuroscience and our very brains are all neutral. So what's very important about the neuroscience when we're thinking of our brain is it's a little bit like software and hardware. We all human beings, whether you're a decision maker, an expert, a judge, or a farmer, or a child, or an adult, we all have that brain that works the same way. We all have that amygdala, which manages our fear response. But then obviously culture that we grow up in teaches us to sort of, identify certain things as dangerous and fear, and we learn different ways of behaving. So what's really also important to know about this brain is, so a lot of things feel beyond our control, like, for example, the fear of people who are different, that can be really strong in many societies. But our brains there's the term called plasticity, which means our brains are constantly evolving and changing. So I find understanding how our brains work helps us understand the sort of populist moment that we feel like we're in, but also gives us ways forward to actually look at changing it. So yes, we see that the other side might offer a vision of change, but that means we also have to offer our vision of change. We'll come back to that in the next shift. But so a similar ad I want to show you that's from the United States, but the similar sort of practice of like the nightmare versus the dream, the hope of what we're hoping to achieve. So in the 2020 election, American progressives were very worried that Donald Trump was going to try and have a coup, so that no matter what the vote results were, he was just going to claim power. But the problem was that message was very, very damaging to their cause, because the more people heard about a coup, the less motivated they were to actually go out and vote, because they thought, well, no matter what happens, if I vote, my Trump is going to win anyway. So what's the point in getting involved? Why should I encourage other people to vote? Why should I donate? Why should I do anything if this dictator is inevitable? So this is really, really important insight that I think applies to anywhere dealing with populist or an authoritarian, is that we need the thing that scares, basically, fear is the populist superpower. And what populists are most afraid of is an alternative. I mean, I think that almost anywhere where there's a populist in power, it's because the existing parties have just really lost faith and trust with the population. And so we really need to always keep people motivated. There needs to be alternatives. So this is obviously, again, very different ad to that Chilean ad. It's made for an American market. But what I'd like you to see is the strategy here. This doesn't talk about Trump or coups at all. They had strategies in place to deal with that eventuality, but their communication to people was about, we decide. It was based on, and it's a very values-based message. So it's not ignoring the problem, but what's really important to be said is we're the people who decide in a democracy, not our leaders.
We, the American people, have never shied from a challenge.
Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We're watching old ideas crumble, just as new ones struggle to emerge. But out of chaos comes change and opportunity. This November, we can take action on climate and create millions of good-paying jobs. We can build a fair economy that is both flourishing and just. And we can honor the Americans lost to violence by rejecting division and moving with resolve toward peace. America has always grown and thrived from reinvention. And this election, we can choose the nation we want to be. The Republicans know that, and they're scared. That's why they're doing everything they can to stop your vote, to silence you. But they're not in charge. We are. Fair elections are the heart of American democracy, and we're going to count every single vote.
So even in the week after the election, when there was this period of doubt and Trump was already spreading this rumor of, like the election being rigged, they stuck with this message of count every vote. And there's a similar strategy that was used in Czech Republic for their recent election, where they managed to keep a populist out of power. We'll look at that next week. By the way, one thing was this video doesn't have closed captioning because it's from YouTube. So if anyone needs closed captioning, do let me know so that next week I make sure I only show videos that have that.
The American people.
So just another example of this more hope-based approach versus populism. The Istanbul mayoral election in 2019 where Ekrem Imamoglu had again sort of really rejected the approach that the AKP party was trying to use of real divisiveness. And so his campaign strategy, they had this idea, the Book of Radical Love, which was basically ignore the populist and love his voters. So really, and then their message on the sort of coffee cup was a very upstairs brain sort of message, saying like, it's going to be okay if we have hope. Maybe I won't go into much detail on this now for time. So I just want to look then, I think, about what is actually, let's looking at fear and hope in the example of people on the move in Europe. So we know what populists and the extreme right are trying to do, trying to stir fear with dehumanizing imagery. So I'm not even going to spend time talking about what's happening in this ad because everyone knows what is happening. The problem is a lot of the time in the news or even in social change organizations, a lot of our message is actually quite similar to the populist message, which is there's a massive crisis, here's a massive problem. So we're creating fears on, and we hope our fear that we create will lead to a sense of urgency and people taking action. But the problem is actually fear is only useful when we face a very short-term immediate danger. But constant fear that you can't act on basically becomes anxiety and stress, and is very damaging to the bodies. Our bodies are not made to be in constant fear over the long term. And so if we're only saying that there's a problem and they're saying there's a problem, we are leaving the door open to those extreme solutions that they come along with. When we are in times of, basically our brains, as I'll show you in a minute, hate uncertainty. So we need to find certainty in what's happening in the world. And if a populist comes along and says, the reason you're feeling this fear is because of those other people, then that gives us a way to find some certainty in that moment we're in. So what's also happening is the sort of sense of crisis, our natural disaster, is constantly being triggered in language that we're using, even subconsciously. So even messaging stories here that are trying to be either pro-migration or even just neutral are calling to mind imagery that really is dehumanizing and undermines our cause. It creates this sense of we're being flooded, overwhelmed, right? This sense, and it's obviously a wave is something dangerous, right? You can get drowned and it's destructive. But we often, even ourselves, right? So we might say in the human rights side that we want safe and legal pathways to safely channel migration. But even the word channel is a metaphor that calls to mind water. Just actually last week, I saw a journalist who was talking about how empathy for people who are different is growing, but he still used the term illegal immigrants without even realizing that connotation immediately calls to mind criminality. And, again, undermines our cause. So on a very basic level, what we're trying to do with narrative is avoid calling to mind these subconscious ideas and not trigger people's fears. Just again, even if we take out the neuroscience on a really basic level, the reason we need to be careful with triggering fear in people is that it's just when you're facing danger, when you feel fear, it triggers self-interest. You want to protect yourself and people like you from the danger. If we want people to be have empathy for other people, if we want them to take action over the long term, and if we want them to be open to changing their minds, we need them to be in this upstairs brain. We need them to be hopeful. And so what we need to be careful of is that there is all the information we use, even if we're trying to use legal or scientific language or facts and graphics, there's always narrative and there's always subconscious ideas in the words and the numbers and the images that we use. So sometimes you might get, if I'm talking about trying to do a good story, like that Chile story, people might think, okay, we're not using facts. It's not about whether or not we use facts. It's about being conscious of the story that's subconsciously present in the facts we're using and the impact it's having on the minds of our audience. So every one of us as human beings can only understand information we receive based on our existing experience. So even when people will see this graph, they're going to be trying to understand it based on what they already know. So for example, they're going to see the words refugee and crisis together, which suggests that the problem is the refugees. This little graph full of stick figures is already calling to mind that wave graphic, even though the word wave is not there, but it's just that sense of all these faceless people coming towards us, which is then also called to mind a little bit with this picture of the world. I'll show you a little bit what it might look like if we start shifting our story, but for now, let's just focus on this aspect of the avoid triggering that fear. So this brings us to our next shift, which is from problem to solution. So again, the point is here is never that we would ignore the problem. Its point is we need to put the problem in the context of the solution. We can't just tell people there's a problem. First of all, people know there's a problem. What they need to know is that there's an alternative to that problem. So a little bit more brain science. So we've talked about our upstairs and our downstairs brain. When we're thinking of I'm basically going to put several other concepts in the context of this upstairs downstairs brain so that we kind of put together what we're trying to do. It's a little bit like when Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high, right? So we know the other side wants people to be afraid and divided and not trust other people. Fear is the tool of authoritarians, but to build democratic societies where we care for each other, we need people to feel hopeful. We need people to trust each other and think better of each other. So we talked a little bit about the idea of thinking fast versus thinking slow. Another aspect of how the brain works that's very useful for the problem to solution shift is the idea that our brains are predictive. So I just mentioned this, that we can only know something that's already in our brains. It's a little bit like I like to use the idea of when you receive new information, you need to go to the bookshelf in your mind and find the book that relates the dictionary or whatever, like that will give you that will teach you how to sort of make sense of the new information you've received. So you basically, I can't start speaking French to you if you've never learned French. The same goes if I would say use technical terms like even the word human rights, right? The understanding people will have of these words, justice, fairness, equality, all depends on their own lived experience. So when our brains are trying to decide how to act or think in a given moment, they do it not based on the information they're receiving right now, but on past experience. So the brain will work so quickly, and we're talking in milliseconds here. It's like we're not thinking about breathing, but our brains are doing it anyway. So there's all this subconscious activity happening in our brains that is influencing, without our realizing it, how we react to other people and also how we act politically. So this is very important in the sense of the predictive brain, that really our brains can only do things based on what they already know. Our brain might act a certain way and then realize, okay, we didn't take on board that new information, so that next time our brain will learn. And a really simple way of thinking about it is you might pass a grumpy colleague in the hallway, and every time you've dealt with them before, they've been mean. So you're ready for them to be grumpy and mean again. But it might be that actually after they've gone, you think back and realize, oh, actually, they were trying to be nice for once, but I just reacted grumpily because my brain immediately assumed. That's just an example of how our brains prepare us to act based on our past experience, and only later, even if that person was smiling at us, our brain will still put the smile in the context of what we already know, which is, oh, they're always grumpy. They must be sarcastic with that smile. The same will goes for politics, right? So if we've constantly received information associating refugees with danger, our brain has really learned and built that in, that, okay, that's dangerous. And remember, all of this is coming from evolution, right? So human beings that were very careful about things that could potentially be dangerous are the ones who survived, and they're the ones whose genes are now in our gene pool. Our brains have evolved to be very suspicious of the unfamiliar. What does that mean for people who are trying to achieve social change? Well, it means we have to realize that the word change is not necessarily something everyone is in favor of. People are suspicious of something that's unfamiliar. So we need to actually make people comfortable and show people a picture of what our change actually looks like. So if we're just talking about climate change as an example and saying we're doomed, we're all going to go extinct, that's triggering our fear, our downstairs brain, right? But it also basically creates despondency. I mean, why should we get involved, go and protest, but also crucially really actually like give up our car, stop flying, start taking trains, really engage in a greener lifestyle if we're doomed anyway? why should we start paying more taxes? And also, the massive change in society that's actually needed to respond to this problem. And a deeper problem here is what's called the despondency trap. If all we ever talk about is the scale of the problem, it starts to become our new reference point. And that's just how things are. Fossil fuels and big economies are just going to constantly keep polluting our planet. So not only are we less likely to act, we even limit what we ask for, because we're just so built into us that only bad things happen, that we would never even think of asking for something more ambitious. And so we limit our very own policy asks because our sense of despondency has grown so great. But then by asking for less, we also then end up receiving less. So what's an alternative? Well, again, like that Chile ad, it's can we show people a picture of the future we're trying to create in which they can see themselves? Think of it this way. Would you get on a train if you didn't know the destination? So if our policy is implemented, how will society actually look different? How's it going to look for you? And so crucially, not just for the rights holder, but also for everyone else, right? Because we want to show them that these changes also create a more caring society that you will benefit from. So there's a psychologist who developed the idea of hope theory, where he talks about hope actually not as an emotion, but just a cognitive function, just a way of thinking. And this has been developed in the medical profession, right? So like with people dealing with serious illness, they need to be able to keep taking the treatment so that because they need to believe they can eventually get better. And he says hope is based on a goal. So like we have this picture, and so I should have told you. So this comes from campaigning that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did around the Green New Deal. So it's a very ambitious policy proposal, which is now also a policy plan in the European Union. But also she wrote this, it's a very long video, so I'll share it rather than playing it in full. But basically it's called a message from the future. So it's saying like, look, here's how we got it done. So goal, pathway as how we get it done, and also then agency, the sense that we're able to get it done. So when we're trying to shift from problem to solution, obviously the problem is part of our story, but it can't be the only part of the story. We also have to show, here's what we're trying to achieve. Here's what we in human rights, this is the world we're trying to build, and here's how we get there. And what's quite useful, I think, for us in activism is moral psychologists have found that people who are high in hope are more resilient. So if one pathway is blocked, say, for example, with shrinking space for civil society, we're more likely to find another pathway to achieve our goals. So this is a very useful example that it's visually showing how we get this change done. And in a way with climate change, it's quite easy, right? So here's an example, but the question for us to try and work on next week is, what's the goal and the pathway for human rights? What does the world look like when we're all enjoying more human rights? So again, this is really a simple way of illustrating what the shift would look like. So because we want to make our solution desirable, we want to put more pressure on decision makers rather than just saying there's a problem, you should act. We want to be saying, look, this is what we want. Here's our policy. Why aren't you implementing it? So these are illustrations from climate. What we want to work on is how this would look like on women's rights, rule of law, the internet, all the various issues you've mentioned. And so the concept that I'd like you I want to introduce you to thinking about this, it's called the Overton window. It was developed by a right-wing think tank in the United States. And they are probably the institution that's been most effective at creating change in the 20th century, because their secret was think tanks, right-wing think tanks, were not about thinking, they were about changing how we think. So they obviously were focused on making people think government is bad. So when they developed, their idea was, on the one hand, you would have basically like what we would consider normal government in Europe, governments that provide schooling and education for everyone. And that's for them inconceivable. And on their side, the other side of the spectrum, they would have like absolutely no government intervention in education at all, which was their dream. But so their point is that politicians don't change really this window, but they only act on something that's within the window. And it's civil society, it's activists, both left and right, who shift that window. So basically politicians will go with whatever is popular, what seems like common sense. So what we've seen in Europe over the last few years is that allowing people to move people who are fleeing a war zone to claim asylum was pretty much common policy about 10 years ago. I'm sort of generalizing here. Whereas now it's common sense for centrist politicians to say migration's a problem, and let's not go into all the terrible things that are happening right now. The point is to say, we've seen politicians on the far right start putting out these extreme ideas that would have just been completely unthinkable in the public space 10 years ago. And what centrist politicians started doing was repeating them, and even left of center, because they know, oh, that's popular, so we need to adopt it. And even we would say, okay, this politician said X, here's why it's terrible they said it. And again, repetition creates familiarity. And remember our predictive brain, the more you start hearing things, the more they sound to seem acceptable and reasonable, and the Overton window is shifting. So that's what the Green New Deal was. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put it forward, everyone was attacking her, but they were all talking about it. And the more you hear about it, the more it starts to shift that Overton window. So if we want to change the sense of what's common sense, so looking at how, for example, in many countries, attitudes around LGBT rights have changed, we have to look at changing what people are talking about, changing the terms of the debate, of the agenda. And so the really key point that we're going to talk about a lot next week is salience, how salient something is in the debate. So that means how present it is, both in terms of volume, like literally, is it in the newspaper today? Is it what people are talking about? But also how strong the emotions and the experiences are that people can connect to when they hear the words. So when people hear the words human rights, what are the emotions and the previous experiences they're thinking about that have happened in their past that we're tapping into? What's already in their brain that we're relating to when we tell our stories? Because something that doesn't really trigger anything, that doesn't relate much to them, it's not going to actually capture their attention. It's not going to be salient. Whereas what the far right are very good at doing is, activating fear and associating fear with something like refugees or with any out group, so that they have those very visceral reactions. I'm just going to skip these for time. I'm taking too long today. I'm in a mode of speaking slowly. Fortunately, we have 2 days. Let me do a quick pause. Sometimes I get through these slides fast, sometimes I don't. Sorry about that, everyone. I want to do a quick pause. I feel like I've been talking a lot, and see if there's any questions on that. And then I'll try and get through one more shift. Any thoughts or questions on what we've done so far? Okay.
I was wondering one thing.
Go for it.
Can you maybe come with an example of, you said that repetition is really key when you want to change a thing. Can you come with something that's successful that's being repeated?
Yeah, okay, perfect. That's my cue to go back to the slides. All right, thanks everyone. So let's do two things. So the whole next shift is about that, but let's just start with repeating things. So I talked about goal, pathway, and agency. So the goal and pathway is quite simple, right? What our change looks like and what is it we need to do to make the change happen. The crucial piece of it is agency. So making people feel they can be part of making the change happen. So everyone has heard of Yes, We Can, right? And I assume you immediately think of Barack Obama. Actually, the expression originally comes from Dolores Huerta, who was a union organizer in California. And she worked with Cesar Chavez. They created a big farm workers union against incredible amount of very violent opposition in the United States. And Cesar Chavez was doing a hunger strike in Arizona, and the local farmers were saying, we can't set up a union in Arizona. It's not like California. The farm owners are just too violent, and we're up against too much. And they said, no se puede, which in Spanish means no, we can't. And Dolores Huerta replied, sí se puede, yes, we can do it. She shouted at them basically saying, yeah, we can do this, we have to, and we're going to. Which they did, but then this became a slogan of their organization, which Dolores started saying out loud, and then Barack Obama started saying it, And for us, it's like a slogan, but actually it's deeply rooted in psychology because people need to believe that something can be done if they're going to work for it. So that's one example of repetition. But now let's talk about this, the third shift of against the for. So if there's anything you take away from what we do today and next week, it's the importance of talking about what we're for and not just what we're against, because what we fight, we feed. Anything we're saying, we're activating ideas in our brain. So we want to start thinking of ideas in our brain like muscles. The more they're activated, the stronger they get. And the more likely our predictive brain is to start using them to understand what's happening. So, literally, is our brain going to take the French dictionary down or our Hungarian dictionary down when we hear a new word to try and understand it? So on a really simple level, you probably can see some commonality. Actually, we should do a survey in the chat, and I'll check it later. Please put in the chat whether you or your organization have ever used a slogan involving the words "not a crime" or "not a criminal." So when we're doing this on a very basic level, the idea around neurons. So remember I talked about the mirror neurons. So our brain is made up of millions of little neurons that are firing up when they're activated. And when two different neurons are firing at the same time, they wire. So the expression in neuroscience is neurons that fire together, wire together. So basically, when we're talking about refugees and crime, we're fusing these two concepts in the brain of our audience. So when we're saying refugees are not criminals, the concepts being triggered in the brain are refugees and criminality. So even if we say we want, and this has come out in focus group testing, even when we say we want legal routes for migration, we're calling to mind the concept of legality, illegality, and we're still coming back to the sense of, oh, we should help people, but not when they break the law by moving across borders. And so the point is, I definitely, and I imagine most of you have this rational need to go and disprove every false argument that we feel is out there blocking our cause, but actually doing that reinforces them in the minds of our audience. So what we need to do is, instead of trying to, what happens is when we engage in the debate set by other people, is we're not actually taking the time to talk about our values and our ways of thinking. So instead of saying journalism is not a crime, what is journalism? What is migration? What is abortion? They're human rights, for example, or refugees are people, they're human beings. We would obviously be more subtle and think through, but the point is, these are reasons not to do something. What are the reasons to actually do the thing we want? So a lot of the time we do this because it feels easier to point out the thing that we're against, and it takes more work to actually articulate what is the thing we're for. But that's what we need to do, because remember, our predictive brain can't support something that we've never told them about. So this is the very basic concept of narrative and framing. 20 years ago, it was written by George Lakoff, who wrote a book called Don't Think of an Elephant, because as soon as you've said the word elephant, you're thinking of an elephant. In fact, Dostoevsky wrote an essay 200 years ago or 100 years ago where he said, if I tell you not to think of a polar bear, you're immediately thinking of a polar bear. But the point is that the words and the images we use are doing a lot of work in the minds of our audience subconsciously without our realizing it. And so we need to be conscious of those. That can feel a bit overwhelming, I know, but so the starting point, and this is the point of hope-based communications, is that we will start with our ideas and concepts, the things we're trying to get across to people. And that's what we'll work on in our workshop next week. So the key idea here is, right, how are you going to tell people not to think of an elephant without saying elephant? Well, you have to tell them what they should think of. So really the subtitle of this book should be, think of a squirrel instead. So we can't just tell people what not to do. And this goes for behavior too. So most of the good things I'm telling you come from a brilliant expert called Anat Shenker-Osorio in the United States. And she points out that lifeguards at the swimming pool, they say walk to children. They don't shout, don't run. So similarly, like if you're any cyclists here, when you're going downhill and you're coming into a tight bend, this scares the hell out of me. But if you look like where you want to go to, you eventually, that's actually where your bike will go. And if you look at like, oh God, if I go that way, I'm going to veer off over that cliff. Unfortunately, that makes you literally more likely to actually do that. So the point is, we need to start thinking about what we actually want and start to ask for it. So we want to welcome refugees. We want these people to come here. We want a more diverse society. We want women to have abortion as normal healthcare. And obviously, we will test and refine the best, catchiest way to do that. But the starting point is to actually articulate the things we want and to start saying that, and not just the things we don't want. And so, again, my mentor in that, good messaging, it's not just saying what's popular today, it's making popular what needs to be said. So remember that Overton window. We're not doing communication just to raise awareness. We're doing it to change awareness. We want to change how people think and how they act. And by doing that, we need to show them the ideas that they want on a very basic level. Again, repetition. So the more people see something, the more likely they are to support it. The rationality is still there. So people's decision-making is a mix of reason and emotion. But so the point is to know that those things are really connected, right? So it's not about just one or just the other, but the point is it's about how people have learned to think over time. And it's about being aware of what are the underlying ways of thinking. So let's basically, the idea is that we have narratives, which I basically haven't gone into in detail yet, but basically narratives are the stories we tell ourselves about what's happening. Those are built up with the stories that we read every day. But the point is, when we read a story, we interpret it according to our existing way of thinking. This is called motivated reasoning. So basically, if we're progressive and we read a story in, say, a right-wing newspaper, like say in Britain, the Daily Mail, and it says something that really challenges our ideas, like human rights, or maybe say it comes from like a Chinese state-owned newspaper and it says like human rights undermine security. No matter what that paper says, we're going to disregard those arguments because our identity is built up in the cause of human rights. And so we're going to say, oh, that's just biased, which probably is. But you know, the point is that human beings have evolved to work in groups. And so our brains are strongly motivated to feel a sense of belonging to a group. And so that includes taking certain positions on issues, and not agreeing with our group on an issue challenges our membership of that group. So we are strongly motivated for our reasoning to make sure that stories fit a certain passage. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is where this idea of meta narratives come in. So underneath the surface of all the different sort of ideas we have about how the world works are these deeper underlying ways of thinking. So this is a nice place for us to pause the presentation. I would like to know, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you see this object? So this is a little bit about thinking, trying to understand how our reasoning works, basically. So let me unshare the screen, and I'd like you to please put in the chat the first thing that came to your mind when you saw this wooden spoon. Cooking, spoon, we've got some literal people. Corfu, that's interesting. Wooden spoon, polenta, talon. So anything, did anyone think of anything not food related? Don't have many Catholics here then. Hitting children, Dalma. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, this is a practice in rural Hungary. Then if a child misbehaves, they are not necessarily are hidden, but they are, you know, there's the threat of being hidden with a
threat. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good word, actually. We'll come back to that. So this, let me just reach out and I'll do one or two more slides on this. So this is basically how I explain the idea of worldviews is, in Ireland, as in rural Hungary, well, rural Ireland and probably, hopefully not anymore, is a symbol of punishment. That if you're bold, you get hit with the wooden spoon. But what the point here is, why would people do that? It's because they think if someone's bold, they need to learn that if you do something wrong, you get punished for it. So it's basically, it's what George Lakoff calls a strict parent mindset, right? That it's very important that we are obedient and that we respect authority because we're all individuals out there on our own, and we need to learn that if you do something wrong, you pay a price for it. So basically George Lakoff associates that way of thinking with conservatism in the United States. And he says progressives are more likely to be a nurturing parent. So the nurturing parent doesn't think that the child will learn through punishment, but actually through nurture, through empathy, through being shown the right thing to do. And this mindset is also more about the collective, right? That when someone, for example, say, gets addicted to opioids or, you know, falls into poverty, it's not just the fault of that one person, it's an environmental, societal problem. Right, and also that, you know, it's not like individuals on their own change everything, but that we work together as a community. And then crucially, we also think of curiosity as more important in our children than obedience, which also, by the way, curiosity is a very important aspect of like responding to anxiety. So this basically relates to our upstairs downstairs brain of basically, do we think about issues with a strict parent mindset or a nurturing parent mindset? So for example, if you think about poverty again, so they might be, if we were to say have higher unemployment support, the strict parent might say, but if you give people all that money for doing nothing, they're just going to get soft, right? They won't learn how to take care of themselves. You can't just give handouts to people. Whereas the nurturing parent might say, well, actually, you need to give people a chance. And if you do, then they can flourish. And so what's important for us from this is to start thinking, what is it we say to convince people, whether they're a decision maker or the general public? What do we say when the facts aren't enough? You know, if you're in your advocacy meeting and, you know, you make a really strong case based on the evidence that there's these problems, but the decision maker doesn't want to do it, well, what's the moral case you would make? Because every human being has some form of this moral decision maker. And often most of us are a little mix of nurturing and strict parent on a lot of different issues. So going back to this repetition and activation point, what's very important is that the more we activate a strict parent mindset, the stronger that becomes in our overall way of thinking. So what the risk is for us is we often try and trigger what we think is the way of thinking of other people. So for example, on migration, we might say, you know, you should support migration because, well, we've got falling population and we need workers in our country. So we're trying to make an economic argument because we think that's what people want to hear. But actually the reasoning is usually just, well, subconscious racism or some other form of problem. But what we do by using that argument is we reinforce the economy and the sense of just we should pursue policies that seem like good for our self-interest as opposed to, you say, common humanity. So this is quite challenging. Again, it goes back to Anat's point. We have to actually make the case for the things we want based on what we think, actually. And so we've, I think, learned in our desire to be credible and taken seriously, not to almost hide the reasons why we want human rights and try and make a security case or a business case for human rights. But whatever case you make for what you want, you're reinforcing that case as more important in the hierarchy of what matters, what values matter in the minds of your audience. So basically what Lakoff says is when you talk, you should talk about your moral worldview. And he says it's about empathy, responsibility, and hope. One of the first exercises we'll do together next week is we'll try and articulate what is the human rights worldview? What's the moral case for human rights that we need to repeat as much as possible so that it becomes more powerful in the minds of our audience? I'll give you one story and then one video. So abortion is a very good example of that, again, where for a long time we have been stuck in this sort of argument of right to life versus right to choose. And what people have found in focus groups is the choice framing calls to mind consumer choice and reinforces in audiences who are in between, right, on not neither one side nor the other, that it makes the decision seem frivolous, which it obviously isn't, right? It's much deeper. But so those words are not calling to mind in our audience the actual life experience of women who are getting abortions, of people who are getting abortions. And so we're often tempted to say, oh, but you conservatives believe that the government shouldn't intervene in people's lives. Therefore, you should be against the government telling women, what decisions they should make in their lives. So we're trying to use the other side's worldview to change their mind. That does not work. What we're doing is reinforcing that worldview. So to go in this, if anyone wants to know more about like that real deep changing of minds, there's amazing writing on an approach called deep canvassing. The summary is, if you want to change someone's mind, the best way is listening to them. And I can share more material on that and we can talk more about it next week. But basically, what was a game changer in Ireland and also in Latin America to a certain extent was they actually had the courage to just say, for a long time, they would limit their ask. They would say, oh, we don't want like abortion in all circumstances, just in cases of rape and fatal fetal abnormality, which almost reinforced the sense of abortion is a bad thing, but just give us a little bit of it. And then they said, no, actually, we just want women to have access to abortion because this is about the 3 C's: compassion, care, and change. And so they changed the frame to make it, when this is about caring for the other people in your life. And that became a frame in which Catholics, who for so long, part of their identity was never thinking about this issue, it's just you have to be against abortion because that's what it means to be Catholic. This frame about just having compassion, it allowed people, first of all, to hear the stories of women with lived experience in this matter, which for many years, it had been completely taboo. Women couldn't go in the media. They were afraid to share their experiences. Suddenly, all the experiences and stories were being told and heard. And you had Catholics and people who considered themselves pro-life saying, I'm going to vote to get rid of this, the criminalization of abortion, because I want to care for the women in my life. So basically, the lesson is have the courage to make the moral case that we actually want. And yeah, let's leave it at that. So I'm going to show one video. Yes, we have time. I'm going to show one video to illustrate what it looks like to start making this worldview, values-based message for basically the underlying ideas that actually reinforce not just an issue like migration, but actually all human rights issues. So what's very interesting here is when we identify these worldviews, these mindsets or ways of thinking, you can start doing campaigning and activism that doesn't just affect one issue, but actually across all of our issues.
These people have a lot to talk about. They just don't know it yet. In a minute, we'll show them that they have more in common than they think.
Hej alle sammen. Tak fordi I er kommet. Thomas, vil du stille dig der? Og Aske? Thomas, du bor med din familie i et dejligt hus på Vinkelhøj 8 i Viby. Før I flyttede ind, var det faktisk dit barndomshjem, Aske.
Det er rigtigt. Ja. Fodbold i haven om sommeren. Og,
det kan jeg lige forestille mig.
Ja, præcis.
Vi laver igen.
Mathilde, vil du komme herop? I to har faktisk stået over for hinanden før.
Okay.
Men der var I 12 år. Og det var i en rugbykamp.
Okay, ja.
Kampen endte i øvrigt 42-0 til Askes hold.
Tak for kampen. Ja, tak.
Inger. Mathilde, den nat, du kom til verden for 27 år siden på Christiania, var Inger det første menneske, du så.
Var du min jordmor? Nå. Det var for fint. Kan du huske det?
Anna, i 2012 er din mand ude at løbe en tur. Pludselig falder han op med hjertestop.
Ja.
Heldigvis er der en, der reagerer hurtigt og redder ham. Knud, vil du komme herop?
Just below the surface, a total stranger can turn out to be someone you're actually connected to.
Det er godt et stykke tid siden.
Someone who rouses forgotten memories. Like the very first kiss. Someone who reminds you that you're not alone. But that somebody else also has a bulldog named Prebin. Someone like Thomas, who put out a fire at Vibeka's place.
Vi er så taknemmelige for, at brandvæsenet kom så hurtigt.
Someone you've been gaming with for years, but
Kender I to hinanden?
have never met.
Nej.
Altamon, mød Lil Salt.
Det er løgn. Du er topfraggeren. Jeg har fandme kendt den anden i 3-4 år, uden at nogensinde mødt den anden, eller set den anden før. Altså.
If we approach each other, we might find out that we share the same destiny.
Rana og Maha, I kom til Danmark fra Syrien for 4 år siden. Dorit og Jan, I har en lignende historie fra 2. verdenskrig.
Jeg har prøvet at være flygtning, og jeg vil aldrig glemme det. Det har betydet usigeligt meget.
Og Rikke, det var din oldefar, der risikerede sit liv ved at sejle Jan over Øresund den oktoberaften i 1943.
It's easy to mind your own business. It takes a little more effort to mind the community. But doesn't the feeling of having something in common, something that connects us, make it all worthwhile? TV2, all that we share.
So that was a television company making the case for migration, for welcoming others, basically. So the basic message from all this, I wanted to give us a bit of the science in advance, is if you repeat harmful narratives, you reinforce them, and the only way to avoid repeating them is to have a narrative of your own. So next week, we're going to work out what should that narrative be on day 1. We'll also look at how to bring it to life, so a bit of communication strategy. And on day 2, we'll do some practical skills for you to get it across. And well, any questions now in a few minutes? And also, why do you think that's an effective message, effective piece of communication around migration?
If I can jump in. So I think it's really effective. It's at the same time, you feel it's a little cheesy, but it's still, your heart is being pulled and you can't, resist the flow of emotions. And it's also, what I liked about it is it portrays being a refugee as one of many experiences that we have. And all of these experiences they talked about were important. Not all were traumatic, but were important. So I think it was nice to build up, positive, hard, and then come the refugee. So you already are in a sort of a empathizing mood.
Yeah, great point, Mark. So one small correction, not correction, but like one tweak I'd make is it's about being a refugee, but it's also about welcoming refugees. So the next shift, which we'll look at next week, is about threat to opportunity. Just as we don't want to repeat the things we're against, we also want to show the actions we want people to take. So this is called social proof. We learn behavior that we see of others. So if we want people to act a certain way, be tolerant or not violent or open-minded to people who are different, any behavior you want from anyone, you have to show them that behavior. You have to simulate it for them. So actually, this is an advertisement. Basically, another lesson with narrative is debates are not things that we win and lose. It's about building the case for what we want. So we don't need to go and all the arguments that harm humane migration policies, like anything around borders, for example. We don't need to go and win that debate. We need to ignore it, neutralize it. And what's the debate that makes people welcome? Well, we're all connected. Communities are built on people helping each other. And so that's what makes people more likely to welcome. That's what we talk about and reinforce. And so Callum.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it was effective, as Marta said, about the buildup, because there were so many entry points. Because even if you can't relate to a lot of those stories, probably everyone's moved house one time and everyone's been born. So at least there were two stories that like almost everyone could have an emotional reaction to. And so even if the others, you weren't personally connected, you could already had your emotions building. So you were kind of primed to feel something at the very end. So I think that was really, really effective how they kind of staggered it up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very great point. When I see, so Shafia, you put this question about how you build trust. So yeah, let's come back to that next week. But basically, this is also about worldview a little bit. It's about how basically on a really to go to the bottom of it. And it's interesting when we think about human rights, it's what do we think of human nature? So do we think that human nature is for everyone survival of the fittest, everyone takes care of themselves? Or do we think that humans are fundamentally social beings who do good for its own sake? And so a large part of trust, it's based on experience and the stories that we see more often. So if we see lots of stories of people robbing each other and being selfish, we're more likely to think that and have less trust. I'll talk a bit more next week about this, politicians, right? If we only see stories about corrupt, there's this one politician in the US called George Santos, who's like ridiculously corrupt. But the problem is the more everyone talks about him, he becomes the prototype in people's mind for politicians. And so we think, oh, all politicians are actually like that, which is really harmful when we have populists, right? Because they're exposed to be corrupt, but everyone thinks, well, everyone's corrupt, so it doesn't matter. So this is where it's really important, is this, we will build up the narratives and the trust that we need with the stories we tell. And that comes in the next two shifts. So that'll be that's the teaser for next week. We'll look at how do we actually build up things we need, like trust. And I think what's really just crucial is the fact that you've landed on trust. So really we can't do this work unless we have a clear goal. So the great goal could be we want more trust in society. And we could think, okay, what are the kind of messages and ways of thinking that will reinforce that trust? And then we can start thinking of stories that will actually bring those ideas to life. That's the formula we're going to work on next week. Sophia, go ahead.
Sorry, just a quick remark. I think it's also, for me, it's more trust and less individualism and more about thinking collectively. And I think, well, obviously in Eastern Europe is very, very hard. Everywhere else, there's the same problem. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Marta.
I'd just like to say a few final words when we close. So I don't know if you guys have any comments now or questions.
So I was going to, there's some very basic pre-reading about hope-based communications that's already been shared by Marta. If anyone there's any aspect of what we talked about today that anyone wants to read more about before the session, I think we've basically given you enough pre-information to dwell on. So you don't need to do much more than what's already there. But if anyone wants to know more about anything we've discussed, just let me know and I can share some material. So what I would invite you to do is to start thinking a little bit about what is the argument for human rights. So can you make an argument for human rights, but without any not? So without being against something, not what a world without torture or the death penalty, but only in terms of a plus. What would we have if we had more human rights in future? So just start thinking a little bit in your head ahead of next week. Marta.
Thanks, Thomas. I think this was such an excellent webinar. And you talked about the goal and the pathway and agency, and I think this camp is going to be about that for us. The goal is obviously to be more just improve and get over this frustration that we so often have about human rights communication, what we are doing, what we're seeing in the world. And this workshop, the camp, will be the pathway to that. And the agency part is that we can all actually do it. So I'm really looking forward to it. I will share the agenda for the camp next week, this evening, and that will include the link to this webinar, the recording, and it will also include the readings that Thomas mentioned. And please take time over the weekend before you come to Berlin to go through these. I think it's going to be fascinating. And also take a look at the agenda and familiarize yourself with what we're going to be doing. There's going to be other social events and occasions built in. And there will be a survey, a very, very quick survey we'll send out along with the agenda, which I'd like to ask you to send in the responses by Monday, but it really shouldn't take long. So I think it's about 10 minutes. This is to help us prepare the camp, the sessions with Thomas. It will ask you about your experience and your ideas about the topics that have been just discussed. And I will also really like to invite all of you to think about case studies or things that you have worked on already as experiences that you'd like to share. There's going to be a slot in the agenda where everyone is invited to present something. I think it could be a success story, but it can also be a dilemma. It could also be something that you tried and you didn't work, but you learned from it. That would be very interesting. I'm sure all of you are running into this all the time. We're trying to get something across, and it worked and it didn't work. Add on, I would like to ask you, because I know that you have it, to present the films or one of the films that you did with Paulina on the campaign against the referendum. I take it he's agreeing because he's not saying no. And I really will invite all of you. There's going to be more than an hour allotted to this. So I think it would be great to showcase some of the examples. Jofi, I know that you also have election-related things that you could perhaps show us. So something where you use communication, a campaign to get an idea across, and that we could learn from, we could discuss. It could be either something new or something that you're also already planning, just short presentation. And if you already know that you'd like to do something, just drop me a message so we know how many we would have.